The Anderson Family's Generational Grudge. My name's Olivia Parker, and if you had asked me 10 years ago what I knew about old money, I would have just laughed. My parents moved to Austin from Colombia with nothing but 3 suitcases and huge dreams they wore on their sleeves. I grew up translating for them at grocery stores and government offices, learning early that even in a country full of promise, some doors had invisible locks. But everything changed the day I met Carter Anderson. Back then, I was a 24-year-old investment analyst hustling for a promotion. Carter was the golden boy of Anderson Holdings, a family empire with roots in oil, real estate, and every exclusive club in Texas. He was charming, brilliant, and apparently reckless enough to fall head over heels for me, a girl from the other side of the tracks. Winning Carter's heart was the easy part. Becoming an Anderson was another story, painted with whispered warnings and long, cold stares. The Andersons' resentment wasn't just fresh, it was fossilized. The family's lineage stretched back generations. They measured time in legacies, not years. From the very first family dinner, I sensed I was dining at a table loaded with centuries of pride and secrets. Every member played their part with precision, careful not to let a single outsider taint their polished name. They saw me as a threat to their traditions. Carter's mother, a socialite with pearls for breakfast, never bothered to hide her disapproval. His father offered me polite smiles, laced with thinly veiled warnings about family standards. The worst part, no matter how hard I worked to fit in, I was always the outsider. There were cold shoulders at charity galas, narrowed eyes at Sunday brunch, and the ever-present knowledge that happiness in this house was rationed according to your bloodline. But in the long, quiet nights, when those memories stung the most, I realized my story was woven into something bigger than myself, a legacy of grudge, silent battles, and old wounds that refused to heal. I learned quickly that in the Anderson family, forgiveness was a rumor, and grudges were passed down like antique silverware. The bitterness began with the ring. The moment Carter slipped the engagement ring on my finger, the world seemed to freeze. It wasn't just a question of love anymore. It was a declaration of war on old tradition. From that day forward, I wore not only a diamond, but the invisible weight of 1,000 expectations from people who believed I could never be one of them. The ring itself was a family heirloom, a glossy oval sapphire flanked by diamonds, a piece said to have traveled from Victorian England to the heart of Texas. Carter's mother, Margot Anderson, handed it over with a smile so brittle, I thought it might shatter right there between us. She whispered, "Take care of it. Many women have worn it before you." Most of them understood what it means to be an Anderson. Her gaze followed the sparkle, searching for doubt in my eyes. But there was only quiet resolve. The engagement party that followed was as cold as a Texas front, expertly planned with antique crystal, a string quartet, and an assembly of guests who all seemed to be part of some exclusive, secret choreography. Whispered conversations swept through the Anderson mansion like a current. I caught snippets. Who does she think she is? Did he really pick her? All delivered with that perfect Southern courtesy. I'd lived through 100 small humiliations before, but this was a different league. The Andersons' country club friends smiled thinly, and every toast in our honor was laced with polite venom. I learned quickly to answer invasive questions with a smile, to hide my trembling hands in the folds of my vintage dress, and to remind myself that dignity was my best armor. Yet the worst came later. In the weeks that followed, small acts of sabotage surfaced everywhere. My invitations to family gatherings mysteriously got lost. Old family friends called to reschedule brunches with Carter, never with me. Margot offered unsolicited advice on how I should adapt and presented me with etiquette books that, I suspect, were meant to shame rather than uplift. Carter's younger sister, Allison, dismissed my choice of wedding colors with a theatrical sigh, then spread stories about my upbringing at her garden clubs. Sometimes I caught Anderson aunts eyeing photos of my family on Carter's phone, judging the Colombian features they'd never understand. Every night, after another battle at the dinner table or another icy phone call, I'd take off the ring and hold it between my palms, feeling its history and its chill. It reminded me that this marriage was about more than joining two lives. It was about forging a new path in a place where every tradition was a fortress. I knew I couldn't make them love me, but I could make them respect my strength. The ring wasn't just a promise. It was the spark that lit the fire of resistance inside me. From that moment on, every Anderson whisper and narrow glance turned into fuel. If they wanted a family feud, I would learn to play their game and play it better. The shocking death and the hidden, it had been 3 years since our wedding. 3 years of learning to move like a phantom within the Anderson mansion's endless corridors. Neither fully accepted nor completely dismissed. Despite the velvet and oak grandeur of their home, every dinner felt staged, every smile rehearsed. I had learned the cadence of their conversations, the code in their silences. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what came next. Carter's grandfather, William Anderson III, was a legend both inside and outside family lore. Patriarch, war veteran, oil magnate, and kingmaker, he had been both revered and feared for his iron will and impenetrable sense of discipline. Even in his late 80s, he was the axis around which the Anderson world spun. When he died, quietly in his study, one late September evening, his passing sent a chill through every branch of the family tree. The funeral drew relatives from every corner of America. A parade of Andersons and hangers-on, all cloaked in somber black and sticky with anticipation. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following afternoon in the grand drawing room, just as family tradition dictated. Everyone whispered their own predictions, some with greed, others with dread. Margot prepared for her expected role as queen matriarch. Cousins and uncles checked their watches and exchanged guarded glances, measuring one another as rivals rather than kin. But William was never one for the expected. His lawyer, Mr. Beck, entered the room with 2 thick envelopes and the air of a man about to set fire to a hornet's nest. The first pages were routine. Legacies for old friends, charitable trusts, minor properties going to favored grandchildren. The atmosphere shifted the moment Mr. Beck unfolded a letter addressed simply to my grandson Carter and his wife. Margot's eyes narrowed, and the cousins bristled. Mr. Beck cleared his throat. To my grandson Carter, and to Olivia. He paused for a beat, nodding at me. I leave not just my share of Anderson Holdings, but controlling interest in all key family assets. This is not a gift, nor payment, but my last wager on the future of our name. My heart hammered as shocked gasps broke in every corner of the room. It was unfathomable. Not only did William bypass his own children, but he placed the weight of the dynasty squarely in the hands of the very outsider everyone spent years trying to exclude. The remainder of the letter was more startling still. Beneath the legal jargon, William revealed a secret. Years before, he had met my parents in Houston. Struggling themselves, they had once helped him during a medical emergency and never requested a penny in return. He recognized then the tenacity, humility, and loyalty that he believed the Anderson name had lost along the way. He wanted to restore those values, even if it meant upending everything. The room was silent, but for the subtle hiss of rage and envy. Margot's carefully maintained poise cracked. Allison's knuckles blanched as she clutched her pearls. Various uncles whispered furiously into their phones, whispers of contesting the will, of legal challenges, of protecting the true legacy, started circulating like smoke. Yet the lawyers were ironclad. There would be no loopholes, no undoing what William intended. Privately, Carter was overwhelmed and unsteady. But I recognized the truth of the moment. William hadn't just handed us a fortune. He had detonated decades of pent-up rivalry with one stroke of a pen. My position had changed overnight. Those who had once brushed me aside as an interloper now saw me as the gatekeeper, the very key to their future comfort, power, and pride. But William's prophecy came wrapped in danger. After the will's reading, the secret games began in earnest. Old allies turned cold. Family dinners became negotiations. I discovered cryptic letters William had left for me in his journals, filled with advice on maneuvering the household, whom to trust, where to dig, and how to wield the Anderson name like a shield and a sword. Some nights, as I sat alone in the shadows of the library, I felt the weight and opportunity of William's choice. This was not the life I'd dreamed of, but it was now my battlefield. No longer the outsider crying in the night. I was the heir with every reason to fight. And for every family member who'd ever slighted me, I made myself a silent promise. I would not waste the power I had been given. I would finally become the force inside the Anderson family, a name carved not into oil fields or ledgers, but into legend itself, the silent war inside the Anderson mansion. The moment William's will was read, and the dust from his funeral barely settled, the atmosphere in the Anderson mansion shifted from frosty to outright electric. Silence took on a dangerous and unpredictable weight. Every corridor seemed to echo with footsteps and hushed voices plotting their next move. The sweeping grand staircase, once only a symbol of old-world luxury, now felt more like the central arena of a chess match, with each family member maneuvering carefully around me, never ending their sentences, but always expecting me to slip. Breakfasts, which had once been formal but predictable, a quiet succession of silver spoons on fine porcelain, became thick with tension. Margot, with her ice and diamonds persona, presided over the table in silent protest, her every gesture carefully calculated to exclude me. She would ask Carter questions about his childhood trips to Nantucket or old prep school friends, pointedly omitting me from nostalgia's embrace. No one mentioned the shift in power, but their silence screamed louder than words. It was in these small, silent battles that the true war began. Invitations for lunch or charity committee meetings arrived late, or not at all. The family's loyal staff, many of whom had served the Andersons for decades, began to hesitate before addressing me, their eyes darting nervously to Margot before complying with my requests. I'd catch whispered conversations in the hallway. "She's not one of us? If she thinks she can just waltz in..." Even Carter started to look haunted around the edges, caught between the bonds of blood and the vows he'd made to me. I began waking at dawn, making rounds of the estate, cataloging what was truly under my control. Accounts, staff, security, even the family horses seemed to sense the shifting hierarchy. Their mood, restless and unpredictable. I started keeping a notebook, just like William had, every slight, every sideways glance, every moment a trusted staff member hesitated or a cousin offered a thin smile. I recorded it all. I was determined not to be caught off guard. But the attacks were never direct or obvious. This was the Anderson way. Sabotage, dressed up as good manners. Carter's Aunt Celia started spreading rumors at her weekly bridge clubs, twisting facts about my family's past into ugly half-truths. A cousin doctored a business email that nearly sabotaged a crucial deal I was overseeing. Allison coordinated a snub at the Heritage Foundation's charity gala,
knowledge is armor,
ensuring my name was left off the list of hosts, even as I was the one who brought in the biggest donations. It was a constant duel, but not with weapons, rather with smiles and sharp silences. I learned the art of the parry, countering condescension with unexpected kindness, diffusing snide remarks with perfectly timed politeness. My every move was watched, analyzed, and, where possible, twisted. If I spoke up too much at board meetings, I was overstepping. If I said too little, I was out of my depth. The mansion itself became a stage. Hallways were battle lines, dinner tables, war councils. The family lawyer was suddenly everywhere, lingering in doorways as if waiting for a slip. Margot began arranging private meetings with family elders, trying to leverage her role as Queen Mother to isolate me. Seasoned staff members, who once offered discreet support, fell silent, fearing for their own security should they take sides. For a while, Carter and I clung to each other, like survivors on a tumultuous sea, trying to prove, if only to ourselves, that love could outlast the onslaught. But I was changing. The pain and anger those cold shoulders provoked slowly transmuted into a different kind of strength. A calculation, a careful weighing of enemies and allies. A resolve not born, but forged. At night, I would sit alone in the library William once inhabited, poring over his notes and reflecting on the Anderson motto, strength above all. One by one, the Andersons began to see that the woman they dismissed as the outsider was not just surviving. She was strategizing. I started winning allies among the board, exposing Allison's sabotage subtly, returning Celia's barbs at charity events with cutting but truthful anecdotes about the Andersons' own shady past. The staff, sensing the way the wind was blowing, slowly began to treat me with growing respect. The children of the cousins, unburdened by old grievances, started spending afternoons in my office, eager to learn about a world beyond Texas's gilded gates. Most importantly, I stopped begging for acceptance and started commanding respect. The games they played became my training ground. Where once I'd have let insults sting, now I let them roll off, using them to identify weaknesses in my opponents. If Margot tried to freeze me out at a family event, I'd take the opportunity to network with a board member's spouse or to solidify new business relationships. This was no longer their game alone. It was mine. The Andersons had built their dynasty on exclusion, but their greatest mistake was thinking that someone from the outside would never understand their rules. What they never saw coming. I planned to use those very rules to win, not just for myself, but for a whole different kind of Anderson legacy. Banquets of lies and jealousy. The Andersons' mansion, cloaked in light and luxury by night, became ground zero for extravagant parties, whose splendor masked malicious intention. Every Saturday, the estate's sprawling ballroom filled with Houston's elite. Tech CEOs, realtors, politicians, and the kind of old money families who could recount everybody's lineage back 3 centuries. To the untrained eye, these were the height of Southern hospitality. But beneath every glittering chandelier, every champagne toast, the air crackled with rivalry, ambition, and quiet contempt. The first party, after William's will, was a study in performance. Margot glided from guest to guest, pearls flashing and compliments delivered with surgical precision. She reigned over the floral centerpieces in steak tartare, orchestrating introductions that kept me just out of the important conversations. Her allies whispered in corners, casting heavy glances between myself and Carter, judging every word I said, as if searching for proof I did not belong. I quickly learned not to trust any smile. Some guests were eager to ingratiate themselves to the new power broker, me, spouting veiled flattery about my fresh perspective and remarkable journey. Others, with more to lose, tested me for weak spots through probing questions about the Anderson accounts, eagerly waiting for me to slip up. Every minute, every move was a test. Allison and her circle of legacy friends were the worst offenders, spiking polite conversation with inside jokes and icy dismissals. They dissected my accent, my fashion choices, and guests' subtle curiosity about my origins. When Carter's cousin Lauren mentioned a prestigious charity drive, Allison jumped in. "Oh, Olivia wouldn't know about that. It's always been our family's event." I held my head high, refusing to bite. These games, I decided, would not end with my humiliation. The truly venomous moments unfolded in the privacy of powder rooms and midnight corridors. Couples whispered about how lucky I was. Others speculated openly that this inheritance would spell doom for the Anderson legacy. "Money always brings out the worst," one longtime family friend declared, glass in hand. But this is historic. Margot's friends, wives with finely tuned radar for social threat, watched me the way a hawk eyes a field mouse. Nothing escaped their notice. Meanwhile, Margot's machinations grew more desperate. At one party, she had my place card inexplicably switched to the far end of the table. At another, she engineered a moment for the family to toast to old Anderson values, a pointed reminder of my outsider status. She instructed the band to play a classic Anderson waltz as the main family members danced, a scene from every Houston Society page, leaving me momentarily marooned before Carter crossed the room to claim me, defying his mother to the delight and horror of their guests. Still, in every challenge, I found opportunity. Instead of hiding, I walked the room, mingling with staff and overlooked relatives. I learned names and stories, slowly earning the trust of those on the fringe. The distant cousins, the longtime housekeepers, the ambitious young executives, eager for a new regime. I listened, memorized faces, and responded to barbs with stories of my own family's sacrifices, never as a weapon, but as a way to redirect the narrative. By the fourth or fifth party, eyes began to change. The bravest allies toasted in my honor, referencing business successes I'd quietly handled behind the scenes. Uncles who once dismissed me began asking for advice. Margot's circle grew tense. Whispers hinted at uncertainty within their own rank. The poison, it seemed, didn't always stay in the cup. It could be traced right back to those who poured it the most freely. The parties may have started as theaters of jealousy and deceit, but for me, they evolved into war rooms. Every evening I survived was another battle won. Every insult, another lesson in the art of survival among wolves. In high heels and borrowed diamonds, I forged my own legacy, slowly forcing the Andersons to accept that power, once shifted, is never easily wrested back, especially when the new queen refuses to play by old rules, when the outsider turns the tide. I never quite remember the precise moment when the fear inside me turned into something else, something sharper, colder, almost exhilarating. Perhaps it was after my 15th dinner, where not a single Anderson looked me in the eye, or the first time I intercepted a phone call meant to sabotage my standing at the company. Or maybe it was during one of those silent weekends when Carter left for business, and the house itself, frozen in portraits and secrets, reminded me that survival here required more than civility. I needed the will to fight, and not just to endure, but to reverse the current itself. At first, defiance came in small, private victories. I stole time in the estate library with William's old journals, charting Anderson patterns. Who allied with whom? Which staff carried family secrets? What events set off each Cold War? I kept notes, private, encrypted, locked with the same paranoia I saw in Margot's eyes when she glanced at my office. For the first time, I saw the patterns of pressure and manipulation, not as obstacles, but as clues. Behind every calculated slight was a kind of fear. Fear of the new, fear of losing power, fear of me. Slowly, I began to test their boundaries. When Allison tried to block my votes at the board, I called in a favor with an old business professor, now an influential consultant to Anderson Holdings, and made sure a new, highly successful acquisition had my name attached. The credit was undeniable. Even the toughest dissenters had to concede. At the next shareholder meeting, I took the stage to present future initiatives instead of waiting to be invited. The applause was polite, hesitant at first, but some younger partners lingered to shake my hand. I could feel the iceberg shifting, inch by inch. What those born into wealth never understand is that the risk of loss sharpens a person's focus far more than the promise of more. My entire childhood had been one of moving against currents, translating mortgage paperwork for my mother, negotiating with landlords, sailing through the undertow of prejudice. In the Anderson house, I rediscovered that survival skill, the ability to read the room, to sense the power dynamic, to know exactly when to push and when to smile, and bide my time. But now it wasn't just survival, it was strategy. I made allies out of the least respected cousins, offering them roles in neglected business projects or help with complicated family disputes. I threw parties for the Anderson grandchildren, drawing out laughter and warmth that the older generations had all but forgotten. Housekeepers, who had once frozen me out, now told me stories about past matriarchs and betrayals, details that I tucked away for the day I might need them. Meanwhile, Margot intensified her campaign. One Monday morning, I discovered a confidential file on my desk, a dossier implying my family's finances in Colombia were under criminal investigation, complete with forged reports and menacing red seals. I recognized it as a bluff, but it was a warning. Margot would stop at nothing. Instead of cowering, I called Margot privately. I thanked her for her concern and suggested that if she truly wished to keep scandal from the Anderson name, perhaps she'd like to compare each of our skeletons over drinks. The next day, the file vanished as silently as it appeared. I knew then I possessed the one tool Margot never expected, her own fear of exposure. Carter was my only true confidant, but even his faith was shaken by the intensity of the politics at play. Our marriage, once a shelter, became a test site for honest conversations and hard boundaries. We fought, forgave, fought again, always returning to the fact that our bond, forged in the fires of opposition, was now tempered steel. But as I stood taller, Carter shed his own illusions. He watched as I transformed and learned to let go of looking for approval from those who would never give it. Together, we formed a united front, one that didn't beg for acceptance but demanded space as equals. My greatest game changer, though, was choosing never to match the Andersons' cruelty. with cruelty. I exposed backroom dealings not through blackmail, but transparency. For example, when a business deal came under scrutiny, I brought in an outside auditor, someone with no history of deference to the Anderson board. The results cleared me and exposed inefficiencies that pointed squarely at Margot's allies. No shaming, no gossip, just facts on the table. Even those who hated me had to respect the outcome. Slowly, those on the periphery, the distant relatives, the weary household staff, even skeptics in the company's lower rungs, began to shift. Invitations reappeared. The most rigid members of the board grudgingly asked for my advice. The children, unscarred by old feuds, referred to me as Aunt Olivia, and the house started to feel a little less cold at night. Of course, the reversals didn't happen overnight. There were setbacks. Anonymous letters arrived at my office. One afternoon, my car's brakes were tampered with. Enough to scare, not kill. I didn't publicize my suspicions, but I left not-so-subtle hints with security. Increased patrols, a new system of cameras, and a bulletproof calm that made the Anderson wolves reevaluate how much damage they could risk in their own den. The untouchable matriarchs took notice, and in the Anderson way, through cautious, almost respectful distance, let me know I'd force them to new terms. By winter's end, I found myself standing in the estate's rose garden, once forbidden, where William Anderson III had written his first will. The frost was thawing, and a new season was unfurling. I took out the old notebook that had once chronicled my wounds and began writing something new: how to turn inherited power into progress, not for revenge, but for legacy. The outsider had stopped fighting just to stay afloat. Now, she was learning how to swim upstream and to turn old lines of division into tributaries, feeding something daring, something lasting, something entirely her own. Grit on the boardroom battlefield, the outsider's true ascendance. When the haze of feuds, feigned graces, and hoarded resentments finally began to settle in the Anderson estate, I found myself standing at the threshold of a new war. Not just the inheritance of a fortune, but the contest for the very soul of a dynasty. The Andersons had tested me in the drawing rooms and at their banquets, but it was the cold, cutthroat world of business that would ultimately separate pretenders from true heirs. The boardroom, where legacy meets ruthlessness. From the moment I set foot in the imposing glass tower that housed Anderson Holdings, I knew the real gladiators didn't wear pearls, but sharp suits and sharper intentions. The boardroom was worlds away from even the coldest Anderson breakfast. It reeked of old money and recent heartbreak. The long, polished table, so often a stage for staged family unity, here became an arena where alliances shifted as quickly as the Texas weather. Each quarterly meeting was a living autopsy of both the enterprise and the family's morality. There was Carter, always trying to act as my shield, but never quite able to reconcile love with legacy. There was Margot, who had traded her Ice Queen role at home for one of silent partner, her eyes conveying threats and calculations in equal measure. But here, more than anywhere else, the real power brokers were Anderson cousins, ancient friends turned investors, and the institutional partners who viewed bloodlines as little more than another risk in the quarterly report. I learned quickly to control my nerves. Early on, I made small but deliberate moves, asking incisive questions, demanding clarity on figures others glossed over, requesting follow-ups that rattled the old guard. I realized that, in this crowd, reputation was minted on competence not just lineage. Every slight hesitation, a shaky voice, a fumbled statistic could be fatal. I countered by mastering each portfolio report, studying late into the night with Carter at my side, sometimes arguing, sometimes simply holding his hand in silence as we tried to chart a future that would honor both our love and the fortune now entrusted to us. Strategic allies and silent assassins. What they never saw coming. I used Anderson's strategy against them. The cousins who'd frozen me out at parties now faced late-night emails and scheduled one-on-ones. Instead of competing for affection or attention, I offered them tangible involvement, project leadership, stake in new ventures, a say in philanthropic partnerships, expanding into South America and beyond. A few responded with suspicion, muttering to Margot that I was angling for something bigger. But enough took the chance, if only to prove they could still outmaneuver me. Slowly, board factions began to fracture, with loyalties redrawn not on birth, but on ambition, results, and, for some, a begrudging respect. Of course, the old guard didn't simply roll over. There were legal feints, delaying tactics, veiled threats to leak stories about my family's humble beginnings, or to question my marriage's legitimacy. I countered with transparency, calling third-party auditors and legal teams, inviting scrutiny and calmly, politely, disarming rumor with documentation and facts. In one infamous session, Margot attempted to corner me about a suspicious financial anomaly in an oil field subsidiary. I had already commissioned a forensic review. By the end of the meeting, the only secrets revealed were those her interior circle had tried to keep buried. It was in these moments, when facts defanged long-held prejudices, that I truly stepped into my role. I realized power doesn't need to shout. It can simply let the numbers speak. Let the opposition run themselves aground on their own mistrust, and let the outsiders write new rules for the old game. Merging two worlds, modernizing the Anderson name. I saw, too, that legacy is brittle when left to calcify on past glory. I wanted more than to simply belong. I wanted to prove, maybe mostly to myself, that the Anderson name could mean more than tradition, more than beautiful houses and championship horses and oil wells. It could be a force for good. It could shift with the times, but remain anchored in resilience. So I wove my Colombian roots into the Anderson tapestry. When some board members raised eyebrows at expansion into Latin America, I organized fact-finding missions and brokered deals that brought in record profits while supporting educational programs abroad. I created scholarship foundations in both Texas and Colombia, named after William Anderson III and my own father. These became not only points of pride, but a message. The Anderson legacy, now, was broader than any grudge or banished dinner guest list. In the board meetings, when talk turned to risk aversion, in the vaunted old ways, I'd share stories about my parents' journey from Bogota to Austin, about grit, about translation, not just of language, but of culture and opportunity. I watched as hardened faces first bristled, then changed, then, when the numbers panned out, finally understood. I was playing the long game, both honoring the family and pushing it forward, refusing to be tethered only to the past. The private costs, strains, sacrifices, and self-discovery. But for every executive coup, every successful quarter, there was a personal toll. Carter's relationship with his family grew more fraught. At times, the pressure almost broke us. There were nights he'd fall asleep on the couch in his office, consumed by conflict between his loyalty to me and the guilt of watching his childhood allies lose their grip on power. There were occasional accusations hurled in the heat of exhaustion. Was I doing this to prove a point to them, or to chase ghosts of old injustice? Even in small wins, I sometimes felt the chill of imposter syndrome. Would I ever truly be an Anderson? Or, in forging a new identity, was I making the dynasty something none of them could recognize? There were times I envied the certainties of my old life, missing my mother's quiet kitchen, the taste of pan de bono, and the straightforwardness of struggle unburdened by chandeliered expectations. And yet, in the clarity of each new morning, I remembered William Anderson III's faith. The man whose will had split his own family apart believed in reinvention, and in me. The journals he left became my Bible, advice on patience, on reading a room, on when to strike and when to let the storm pass. I took to walking the estate at dawn, breathing in the sweet Texas air, and reminding myself that power, in its truest form, is the courage to keep going when every instinct tells you to run. The Anderson Standard, protecting more than a name. Powerful enemies didn't vanish. They just found new disguises, private investigators, tabloid inquiries, ominous legal notices slipped under my office door. These became part of my landscape. Margot cultivated younger allies, some of whom tried to sow division with whispers about my agenda. When the Anderson Trust came up for renewal, I invited its stewards to dinner. No spouses, no heirs, just straightforward discussion. I made them understand that the true measure of leadership wasn't preserving status, but earning trust each day. The Anderson Standard, as it turned out, was not about who had the longest pedigree or the loudest cheer squad at family galas. It was about who could weather the unpredictability of the world and shield the family name, not just from public scandal, but from its own worst impulses. I had to be the firewall, the fixer, and the future maker, and sometimes the only one willing to say no. Redefining victory, from survival to stewardship. Gradually, the tides shifted, never all at once, but unmistakably. The cousins seeking to undermine me a year before now invited me to strategic retreats. Dissenters on the board became sounding boards for new initiatives. Carter and I made a rule. One night a week, no Anderson talk, just ourselves. A small act of rebellion and recollection of why we clung together through all this. In the eyes of younger Andersons, those still years from their first awkward gala, I started to see something like hope instead of suspicion. My proudest moments came not in closing deals or silencing critics, but in watching the family's companies uplift communities that had once only been sites of extraction and profit. Profits were still king, but now Anderson became shorthand for hard-nosed ethics, for investment in people, for honoring a promise that the next generation could build something bolder, rather than just inherit what remained. The legacy I choose. Years from now, when the portraits in the Anderson halls gather dust and my own name takes its place beside them, I hope the story people tell isn't about the outsider who took over. Instead, I hope it is of the woman who forced open century-old doors, who raised up the misfits and overlooked, who brought together grit and grace, and built something that felt like both a hard-won inheritance and an act of faith. In the end, being an Anderson was never a birthright. It was a decision. My story began in translation, in the uncertain spaces between continents, languages, and worlds. It ended, if stories ever truly end, in stewardship. A relentless, imperfect, hopeful forging ahead, even when the mansion lights had dimmed and my enemies had grown quiet. Not because they were defeated, but because a new piece had finally become more valuable than an old grudge. And in building that piece, I found myself.